NATO and European Union countries are currently debating Ukraine's request to use donated weapons to attack targets within Russia. French President Emmanuel Macron has been the highest-profile leader calling for this, and he appears to have support from US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron. Outgoing NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg weighed in on the issue this month, agreeing that NATO countries that donate weapons to Ukraine should not face restrictions and should be free to attack targets within Russia if Ukraine chooses to do so. Mr. Stoltenberg has also provided his opinion, as he is close to the end of his term and is freer to speak, and he is taking this moment to publicly criticize the Ukraine policy of the US administration. Mr. Stoltenberg criticizes US President Joe Biden for opposing the use of donated US weapon systems or any other donated weapon to attack targets within Russia's borders. President Biden and his national security advisor Jake Sullivan are concerned that allowing the use of US and Western weapons against Russian targets will risk escalation of the war. Russian politicians and allies of Russian President Vladimir Putin have stated that attacks on Russia by Western weapons would serve as justification for the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine and against the country that supplied them. This threat, along with several nuclear drills held by Russia, has caused the White House to take a cautious approach. Consequently, the US has imposed stipulations on the conduct of the war. Given that the US currently donates the largest quantity of military aid to Ukraine, it holds significant influence over the use of Western weapons for attacking Russian territory and the conduct of the war by Ukraine. Mr. Stoltenberg is clearly growing impatient with the US administration's cautious approach and micromanagement of the war. NATO countries pushed Biden to allow the donation of ATACMS, F-16 and M1 main battle tanks, which he eventually agreed to, but only after intense pressure from NATO leadership and member countries. Stoltenberg and other European leaders have expressed frustration over the US administration's divided stance on the use of weapon systems. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin are in favor of allowing a freer use of US and Western donated weapon systems. President Biden and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan are cautious, intent on keeping the war contained and managed, and do not want to risk escalation by allowing Western weapons to attack targets within Russia. Therefore, even though the president has made his position publicly known, the factions discussing issues with Western partners have the power to water it down. The problem with the Biden-Sullivan approach is that it clearly outlines the restrictions and communicates them to the Russians. This has enabled the Russians to understand the restrictions and adjust their military strategy accordingly by establishing safe havens within Russia's borders. The administration's strategy employs a micromanagement style of warfare, a departure from the Lyndon B. Johnson administration's handling of the Vietnam War from the White House. Johnson's war management also prevented attacks on safe havens in Cambodia and Laos, enabling North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces to conduct operations in South Vietnam from these safe havens. The current administration has renewed this practice. Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin are generally in disagreement with Biden-Sullivan. Secretary Austin, a product of the post-Vietnam US military, has a predisposition to not allow the mistakes of the Vietnam War to happen again, and once the political decision is made, the military decides how to best accomplish the goal. This is the theory, and it breaks down if there is political manipulation of the conduct of the war, and it can be successful in avoiding the type of war strategy that Lyndon Johnson enacted. Secretary Blinken comes to the same conclusion as Secretary Austin, but arrives there from a different direction. Blinken is no Henry Kissinger and is willing to defer to the European position so as to create a consensus with the United States and its allies instead of providing clear US leadership. When discussing policy in public, the two most powerful cabinet officials are not in public rebellion with the administration, but they are not hiding it either. So the split in the White House is not behind closed doors, and it is well known to the world, including the Russians. Secretary General Stoltenberg, who publicly disagrees with the US president and aligns himself with the Blinken-Austin faction of the US administration, clearly understands that international pressure can manipulate US policy that can be destabilizing. The destabilizing aspect of this lack of leadership and Vietnam War-style policy is that, under sufficient pressure, Biden has conceded to the donation of ATACMS, then M1 tanks, and finally F-16s. The White House's inflexible positions are ultimately flexible when pressure is applied, allowing them to concede on weapon systems that were previously firmly restricted to Ukraine, but have now been sent there on differing timelines. F-16 training is still ongoing and not yet deployed to Ukraine. The destabilizing factor is that the administration, rather than adopting a position of strategic ambiguity to keep the Russians guessing what the US and its allies will do, has publicly stated clearly defined limits. However, with the correct amount of pressure, the administration will relent, change its policy on weapons, and then still attempt to manage the war from the White House. This implies that any policy, regardless of how strongly argued, is susceptible to change. Strategic ambiguity leaves Russia uncertain about the US's actions, thereby necessitating a degree of self-discipline as Russia struggles to discern whether it is crossing a boundary. The White House's current approach involves policies that articulate rules, which can change when public pressure intensifies. This may seem like a difference without a distinction, but the subtleties are what make the two important differences. Strategic ambiguity leaves one party uncertain about the boundaries and can be difficult to counter without resorting to escalation or threats, as there is no explicit policy in place. Threats can counteract public red lines that are subject to change without notice by issuing counter red lines against any policy changes, thereby forcing them to remain unchanged. The US administration, though it has told Ukraine that it can attack Russia using its domestically manufactured weapons, has requested that Ukraine refrain from attacking Russia's oil and gas infrastructure. The goal of this policy is to prevent disruptions in the supply of oil and gas to the global market, as the sanctions on Russian energy trade aim to annoy Russia, such as setting price caps, but not eliminate the oil and gas from the market. Domestic politics in the United States are the most likely reason for this porous sanction process, which is not a loophole to the sanctions but an intentional feature. The US administration's position contrasts with the direction the Europeans are going under the leadership of President Macron and Secretary General Stoltenberg, who are both receiving sympathetic support from Secretary Blinken. The Europeans become frustrated when their arguments seem to be accepted by the administration, leading them to make progress in changing the US policy regarding a weapon system to be donated to Ukraine. However, they fail to apply the same logic to other weapon systems they need to convince the administration of. Mr. Stoltenberg and his European allies are striving to establish a €100 billion fund that is immune to the political whims of either the European Union or the United States. This would enable the Ukrainians to depend on aid for their war effort, unaffected by the results of European and American elections. This would also eliminate the US administration's micromanagement of the war effort, provided they agree to remove the restrictions on the use of donated weapons and the types of weapons that can be donated. It is unusual for the NATO Secretary General to be so publicly opposed to war with its largest and most powerful member state. It is a byproduct of a confused and divided administration, whose apparently only principal commitment is to follow a proven failed policy that has not been used since the Vietnam War. Those principles are subject to change if enough political pressure is applied. Even making these exceptions will create diplomatic confusion and greater instability. The challenge for Stoltenberg is the open question of whether he even has authority to do what he is attempting. Budgetary decisions and the decision to use military force ultimately fall on the member states, not NATO. Macron supports working within the European Union framework, which is part of his current crusade to reshape the EU. Germany prefers to work within the framework of the funds they have set aside in their budget to support Ukraine. This means that German aid is not subject to EU unanimous consent, putting it outside both Stoltenberg's and Macron's visions. However, his biggest obstacle is the US administration's cautious approach to the war, which restricts strikes on Russian territory, lacks appropriate deterrent strategies, and allows Russia to continue selling its primary commodity to fund its war. While the adopted approach to supporting Ukraine in its war is flawed, it is not Stoltenberg's or NATO's duty to rectify it despite its contentious nature.